Anyway, shall we go?
Yeah, I guess we might as well go then.
Your mum, tell her.
Oh yes.
That's how all the jokes start.
Yes. That's me in 1986 or something. Brave man.
You can sit.
I had a moustache.
Yeah, the start.
So we'll start with how I...
You can sit.
No, I want to stand.
Oh.
So that's White Dwarf 28. That's
Don't kick that
first
bottle over.
White Dwarf
Don't
magazine.
kick this beer bottle.
I won't. That I started with. But how I got working for Games Workshop is the beginning of how me and Dave started writing game books. And in 1980 something like that, I finished my degree at university, and I went home and I hung around not knowing what to do, couldn't get a job, sat around painting little figurines, little goblins and dwarves, and a huge Seleucid army of elephants and phalangites. I never found anyone to play against, but anyway.
That's been the story of his life.
Yeah, that's true.
What degree did you do?
It was politics.
Seleucid.
A boring degree. And my mum got fed up with me being at home all day long, so she got White Dwarf magazine, and in the back there was an advert for a features editor on White Dwarf. And she said, why don't you apply for this job? And I went, I'll never get that job. It's like applying for the best job you've ever possibly hoped for. You know, I spend all day writing, playing games and all that. I thought, I've got no chance. And so she rang up Ian Livingstone out of the blue and said, my son is obsessed with games, will you give him an interview? And he got on really well with my mum, and he said, okay. And then I got the train up, and I did the interview and I got the job. So my mum got me the job at White Dwarf magazine. And then like 20 years later I met Ian in Brighton, and there was my mum lived in Brighton, and there was like a develop conference, and he took him back to meet my mum, and that was lovely. So because
much of your salary she took every month?
Yeah, I never gave her any money. She complained after I'd done. She complained after I'd done so many game books that I'd never dedicated a book to her. So I wrote in the front of one of the books, "To my darling mother," and it was a dual master book called The Arena of Death. Perfect for your mum. But anyway, so I end up working on White Dwarf magazine. I'm right in the middle there with Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson in the office the other side. Every now and again, my mate Dave comes into the office, and he's writing article after article for White Dwarf magazine. And he comes in the morning, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, I'm sitting there working, he comes in, opens up a bottle of vodka. And then in those days, and he gets a cigarette out. And you could smoke in the office in those days, in 1982, so smoking and drinking vodka.
Kids don't do this.
Yeah, don't do this. Yeah.
Don't
Tell
me what I have to do, you're not the boss of me.
And so there he is. I mean, we need an article on RuneQuest. He goes, sometimes you just sit in the corner of my office, type up an article on RuneQuest, and then leave with his bottle of vodka. So that went on for a while, and then Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson wrote the first Warlock of Firetop Mountain, and that took off massively. The English version didn't have a paragraph error in it. Yeah. And then they did so well that they were about to get White Dwarf magazine into Smith's, I think, which was the next one.
Yeah, so this was the first one that was actually good. W.H. Smith's is the big chain of bookshops in. You're going to kick that bottle. Drink it.
So that's why it says the name of the game, What is Dungeons and Dragons?
Right.
Yeah.
So, and Ian had figured that because all the fighting fantasies were in Smith's, so they should have a series.
We should explain that Smith's is a big chain of newsagents in the UK.
Right.
So beforehand, White Dwarf was only in hobby shops, in game shops. So this was a big thing for White Dwarf.
Yeah. I mean the circulation was going up to 50,000 from about 10,000. So
not that much, but
yeah. And so he wanted a 4-part game book, and at the same time, about the same time, Workshop decided to do a computer game, which was this Tower of Despair that Jamie worked on.
Yeah.
So we were
with Steve Williams.
Steve Williams.
Was,
yeah. Me and Steve Williams wrote it, and a couple of guys at Workshop coded it.
And they made that had a paragraph error, I'm sure, when I played it. Because it didn't work properly.
Yeah, you just made the wrong decision.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Right.
So that was one of the first text adventure games, and Dave did a solo, like 100, 200 paragraphs, was it? in the magazine. That was the first thing you'd ever done.
Every issue, I think, so it was 400 in all. In fact, do you remember, I was actually working with my bottle of vodka and my San Ritz and typing away, and a guy phoned up the office and he said, I want to ask about this Castle of Souls adventure. And so Jamie said, well, I've got the author right here. And he said, I've just opened this chest, and it's poisoned me, and it's killed me, and what am I supposed to do about that? And I said, well, you're dead. Because, well, what do you expect me to do? And I said, well, you have to play the game again. Right, I've got to start at the beginning. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry, but have you ever played a game before? That's what happens.
Well, of course, he had never played a game book before.
No, he just, some bloke would want to.
They were so new, people didn't know how they worked.
So I've got to just do this bit, because Ian Livingston then said to me, we'd like to sign you to do a series of game books that Games Workshop will publish ourselves. And I was on the point of signing this, and I was offered a deal from Grafton Books to do the Golden Dragon books instead. Luckily, I signed that because Workshop never did a series of game books, and the contract was one that would have allowed me to do nothing for anyone else. It was a lock-in, basically. So, luckily.
So actually, the talk earlier, those of you who heard it, was all about how they would design a role-playing game and then it would get cancelled. So this is the opposite. This is where he made the right decision and got published.
Exactly. I'd learned from my mistakes by that stage. So, I guess so. Yeah. This is so we both went off to do our own things.
So Talisman of Death was then all these books did so well that publishers were desperate to publish their own versions of game books, and there were literally only a few people in the country at the time who understood how they worked, and we were all working at Games Workshop. I'll show you a picture later, which will be very interesting, about all of the guys that worked at Games Workshop.
And by the way, half of us played in the same role-playing game every week.
Yes, and half of us, we did, like Mark Smith had
and Oliver Johnson.
If you remember Talisman of Death. So this is the first one that I'd ever done with Mark Smith, and he ran a campaign, a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, in which he created the whole world of Orb, and that's the world we use for this. And anywhere the Tiger fans out there? A few at the back, but that whole thing was Mark Smith, and they started the Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston Present series because Steve and Ian couldn't write them fast enough, so they got us to write them, and then we did Talisman of Death whilst I was still working.
I know. Well, you didn't know that.
Lots of people to write. We were still working at Games Workshop, and then on the BBC News one day, this came up, my book and this book and a couple of others, and it was about how shockingly violent they were, and that some children were having nightmares. And the newsreader read this out. 205. As you are about to open the door, you hear a click, and something thumps you on the back. Looking down, you see the bloody head of a harpoon protruding from your stomach. Your hands clutch at the gaping wound as you try to stop your entrails spilling into the slime of the sewer. Mercifully, death takes you swiftly. Turn to 109. So that was like, this is shockingly violent for our 12-year-old children. And we were all going, oh no, God, we've gone too far. And then next week, sales of Talisman of Death shot up the charts as all the children were going to their mummies and daddies. I want the one that gives you nightmares, Daddy.
I have to say, that happened shortly after I'd just started to be employed by Games Workshop, and I fielded a call from the Puffin editor, who was really, really worried about this. And I knew nothing about anything at that point. I was just an editorial assistant on White Dwarf. And she said to me about this, well, what are we going to do? And I said, don't worry, the sales will go up. Ian Livingston's not in, sorry, but don't worry, the sales will go up. Sure enough, they did.
But they did. So, and that became the norm for game books. You were allowed to do violence for kids. I didn't even think about it when I was writing it. You know, I was like 22, and I read these books, I played the games, I did Dungeons and Dragons. That was a normal thing for us.
You have to say in the 70s that most of the fantasy books we would read, even as kids, were pretty violent.
Yeah,
I mean,
the Barbarian.
I got something I wrote in as a primary school, so I was 10 years old, and I'd written a science fiction story, and it has the guy cutting people's arms off and disemboweling them, and you know, the teacher just said, this is really gripping stuff.
Yeah.
He didn't go, oh, you need to see a psychiatrist or anything.
Well, that's an interesting point, because about 6 months ago I went to a fighting fantasy convention in England, and a woman came up to me, she was 30 or 30ish, and she said, I loved your Talisman of Death book, and she recited to me that whole paragraph that she knew by heart. And she was saying how she put that into her literally things she'd be doing at school. And she got in really bad trouble for being, and they just referred her to a psychologist.
Wow.
She loved the Talisman of Death, and that was her favourite book.
Wow.
So that's sort of interesting about the history of the violence of game books. But because they're all fantasy, if you were writing that and it was like, I don't know, an episode of a modern day realistic thing, but because it's like goblins and ninjas and all that, it's not real, you can get away with it.
There's actually, it reminds me of a curious thing that the British film censor was asked why he didn't censor the scene in Robocop, the original movie, when I was going to actually say something.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, but when Robocop was taken apart by, you know, the pneumatic drills. And
That's the bit that I felt queasy about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And he said, why didn't they said, why didn't you censor that? And he goes, it's really violent. He goes, but it's happening to a robot, which means just fuck off. You've got no idea at all.
Whole plot of Westworld.
I mean, it was a great scene, but he didn't even get you're supposed to care about it. Now, I was just going to say about Lord of Shadow Keep.
Right.
That was one that was going to be Final Fantasy 12, because Oliver Johnson and I had a meeting with Philippa Dickinson, who was the editor at Fighting Fantasy, and she agreed to do Lord of Shadow Keep. But then I signed the contract to do Golden Dragon. I signed to do 2 books. But then Oliver came one time. I went for a drink with the editor, and I left, and they were well into the whiskies. And the next morning, he phoned me up with a hangover to say, it's not a 2-book contract, it's a 6-book contract, and we're each doing 3 of them. I go, well, okay, but he'd already got another job. How are you going to get them done? He said, well, Lord of Shadow Keep can be one of my books. I go, okay, but remember to tell Puffin. And actually, a couple of months before it was due in, he finally told the editor at Puffin, oh, we're not going to do Lord of Shadow Keep for Final Fantasy, we're doing it for our own series. And she said, wait a minute, how dare you? You've got the contract, and I thought you were going to do it with us. And he said, it's Dave's fault. It was nothing to do with me. But I then got a call and was really blasted by her. And I was like, wow, because it's nothing to do with me. But we parted on very bad terms, because I often end up looking like the bad guy in these things, because Oliver is so like, oh, butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. And
I use the same tactic.
Yeah.
Oliver and I worked together.
She then became the editor that took over where I was about to do Dragon Warriors. So I thought, this is going to be really difficult. But luckily, we then had lunch, and I explained how it had come about. And she'd had some other encounters with Oliver and realised that he would, if possible, always pass the buck. So I got away with that. But okay, so next.
Next is nothing.
Nothing much happened for a bit, yeah. And then
Dave and Jamie and the other game book authors.
we got stoned a lot.
Blankly
Yes.
in space,
We did get stoned quite a bit. And then Jamie did The Way of the Tiger.
There I was still at Games Workshop, and I was working on board games and White Dwarf, and Joe Diva was there too, and Gary Chalk was doing covers for White Dwarf, and he was doing all the pictures on. Any of you played Talisman, the board game? Yeah. You've got to remember it. So the first edition, Gary Chalk was doing, and we were playtesting.
Yeah, right. He wrote there's an advanced edition from space, time twist or time warp edition.
Of Talisman.
He wrote too.
Yeah, so he was doing all the cards and the art, and he was full-time employed, as was Joe. And then Joe Diva announced that he and Gary were leaving Games Workshop to go and do Einsamer Wolf. And off they went.
That's not quite what they said, though.
No, they said to go and do Right Lone Wolf. Well, actually, Joe Diva sometimes just spoke in German.
Yes.
Einsamer Wolf. What? No, he didn't know. Although we always had nicknames for him, so he was called Judge Death. And I was known as Tentacles Thomson.
No, you were no, he was Lord Dong.
Oh, yeah,
forever will Lord Dong.
And then Tentacles Thomson, yeah. And Judge Death. I can't remember what Gary was called. Anyway, so, and that got us all thinking. So I was the next to leave, so I left with my friend Mark Smith that we'd written Talisman of Death with. We used his world to put ninjas into Middle-earth, and that was our take on it, and we did The Way of the Tiger books, which we've recently republished, and also done some Kickstarters. So there's a prequel book and a number 7. So there's now 8 Way of the Tiger books.
And book 6 was fixed up a bit.
Oh, and we fixed book 6 that got into a bit of a mess because Mark Smith wasn't very good at flowcharting.
He was still stoned by then. So,
yeah. And that ended up me and Mark Smith going off and doing Way of the Tiger. Then we did the Falcon books and then the Duel Master 2-player game books. So all of those were because Joe Diva left, and in those days we could walk into a mainstream publisher and get a deal offered to us on the spot. They would give you a check now, because these game books were like computer games are now. They sold all over the world really well. So that's when I finally left, and Ian Livingston never quite forgave me, but he still sort of...
He gave you work later on.
He gave me work later on. He gave me a job at Eidos.
Yeah, but revenge is a dish best tasted cold. It was just waiting.
And we tried to do something different with the Way of the Tiger books. Those who've read them will know. But it was all about the combat. So we would have decisions would be made about what kind of attack move you would use. So we were trying to do a beat-em-up computer game in a game book.
But I think it's more
but it worked very well, yeah.
Each book is really quite an innovative approach to what a game book can do.
Yes.
You've got one where you're actually running a city.
Yeah, so
each book is really moving.
So you start off as a ninja character in a sort of Middle-earthy world, and it's fairly traditional. You have all these fights, and then you become the ruler of a city, and then we had to fight a war, and in that I'm doing this particular bit rather. Mark Smith was to create a battle in game book. So will you attack on the left flank? And there was a whole lot of stuff about what units you had, and those determined what you could and what you couldn't. So will you attack in the middle? Where will you put your archers? Where will you put your cavalry?
But
and
really
that was quite
way
interesting.
ahead of their time.
Yeah.
Much later, I pitched a similar idea to Livingston for a fighting fantasy book, and he didn't seem to be interested in it. But Armies of Death came out.
You never liked the original idea.
A year later.
No, too original.
Interesting.
Right.
Next one.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No. So about the same time, you won't get copies with these covers, by the way, because these were the original British covers.
Is that the original ones?
Well, they were never used.
Oh, right.
Because they commissioned these, and to be fair, they were a bit hairy. I mean, a lot of tash hair going on. But one thing about Bloodsword was, I didn't want to call it Bloodsword, but they said it's got to have an exciting name, and somebody came up, I think maybe Oliver, with the idea of Bloodsword. And I said, okay, I don't mind it being called Bloodsword, but one thing is it mustn't have gore dripping off the word blood, because that's such an obvious thing to do. And so this logo would have been okay, but when I actually went to the offices, they'd replaced these covers, and they got blood dripping off blood.
This looks like Blade Runner, actually.
Any of you played the Bloodsword books?
No. The idea behind them is
if we had Ollie here, the collector, he would
up to 4 people can play. So there are 4 different character classes, and you can either play solo or you can play together, but there will be some paragraphs that will say the enchanter should read this section. So whichever character class you've taken will get some special sections that happen only for them. But so you can play it as a team or solo, and they also have tactical maps, which I didn't really want to do, but we went to a meeting, and the publisher, I thought it was all set, we were ready to go, and a new publisher had come in. There's always some politics, and the new editor says, I don't know if they're unique enough. And I was going, there aren't any other game books where up to 4 people can play together. And she said, no, I don't know, you need something else. I said, tactical maps. Okay, that sounds good. So then we were doing them, and every day I was cursing this, saying to Oliver, why have we ended up with these bloody tactical maps, which they also printed far too small? And really, I just should have just forgotten all about that and just never put them in. And I'd like to redo these books and take the tacticals, because I'm more interested. It's really a massive quest. The 5 books form this huge quest. And it's the story, the quest that matters, not the tactical battles. So one day I'll redo those. Anyway, onwards. This was our role-playing group in those days.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
That's Paul. That's Oliver, and that's Dave with the beard.
Yeah.
Oliver, you may know, if you've ever seen the TV show Black Books.
He's
spitting image of, what's his name, and actually resembles him in other ways as well.
Bernard Black, yeah.
Bernard Black.
Bernard Black, yeah.
That's who he is.
He's got is it cigar in his
He's got a
mouth?
cigar.
Yeah.
So much of our role-playing stuff got into our game books. So the
Yeah,
Way of the Tiger I was telling you about was my friend Mark's fantasy world. So you read Way of the Tiger? Have you read Way of the Tiger books?
Sure.
So most of the characters that you'll meet in there as villains are actually characters in his role-playing.
Yeah, actually,
And that's the thing that we got from critics, that they would say that the worlds that we created felt more real because stuff was going on behind in the background. When you write a game book, usually it's just about you and who you meet. But in this, you would go into a town and you would see events happen around you, political or violent murders, and these were all things done in the game. So they were like, there's one bit in Where the Tiger, you go in and you see outside a temple a guy getting his head chopped off. I don't know if you remember that, from a guy from the Legion of Doomover, I think it was, who's the Honoric is the big bad guy, the sword. But that was actually from our game, when one of my characters had his head chopped off.
no.
And so we put that in, and that made it feel like, to the reader, that this was a living, breathing world, that stuff was going on that wasn't about you, it was just the things of the world happening. And that gave our books a greater depth.
So I've got my own being photographed.
This was our weekly session. There's just two things I want to say about it. One, I wish our table at gaming sessions these days was as uncluttered as that, because it nowadays gets filled with crisp packets and all kinds of, you can't even get your character sheet on it. And that looks relatively clear to me as a table in these days. Yeah. And also, that's my leather jacket.
Which you still got it?
Which, no, because you ripped a lapel off at one time.
A princess, no, not princess, Leela costume.
Oh.
Okay,
Cut
you cut it up and
Yeah.
used it as a costume. Okay, so that's fine. But that was, a long, long time ago, and we were very drunk. So,
You just turned into the fast show.
yeah, I know. I just did a bit of fast show.
And the right on the...
That's
Oh,
Jack
that's
Brower.
right.
Jack Brower.
You didn't write
That's a character from My Name is Earl, I'm pretty sure.
He is actually a pretty well-known folk
musician, yeah.
But he's
It's like folk musician, game book writer, game book writer, game book writer, game book writer.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it goes.
I don't know why actually Mark Smith, was
He's
also...
not there.
He would normally sit here.
Maybe he was
So
taking the photo.
Maybe he took the photo, yeah. Although Steve... Well,
Steve took the photo.
Anyway, normally he would be there. So...
There you go.
Yeah. So, at the time, or just shortly after, Paul started to write some of the most interesting titles in the Fighting Fantasy series.
No, well, I got into it by writing a role-playing one. Because I started working at Workshop after Jamie had left, in fact, possibly because Jamie had left. And
I'm sure how to take that.
no, you had to be replaced.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yes,
You
but
still
was,
do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Take two people to replace you.
So, and it's the same. It's the same principle that me and Steve Williams, who I mentioned earlier, who worked with Jamie on the Tower Display computer game, we were editing Warlock magazine at that point. So we became the obvious.
Warlock, you better explain.
Oh, so Warlock magazine was the Fighting Fantasy magazine, which I will just mention. When I went to Japan in 1991, one of my biggest surprises was finding an issue of Warlock magazine, issue 73, in my local newsagent.
73?
I didn't know
Yes.
you got that.
It did, yes. Warlock magazine 73. Because what happened was, Japan published Warlock magazine and translated it all. And when Warlock magazine stopped in the UK, they just carried on.
Oh, okay.
So this was like, for me it was weird. It was like, hey, I worked on this. It's like, and it's just carried on in Japan. So we were the obvious people for exactly the same thing that had happened in their generation. I'm going to say, which makes me sound a lot younger. That Steve Jackson wanted material for his Fighting Fantasy role-playing game. So he came to me and Steve and said, can you write one adventure? I'm putting together a book of 4 adventures. Can you do an adventure for us? And I can't remember why, but we just came back and said, we'll write the whole book for you. And obviously nobody else, possibly Steve had asked nobody else, I don't know. But we came back with a synopsis for the entire book, and he accepted it, and that was The Riddling Reaver, which is a set of role-playing scenarios.
For Fighting Fantasy.
Sorry,
I love it.
for Fighting Fantasy. Really? Well, I enjoyed writing it.
It's wacky, but it's...
Well, you can. That's Southern,
like Paul.
Southern Comfort and ginger ale.
We were still
and-
quite stoned a lot of the time, even now.
I wasn't. I was.
Oh no, Paul never. He never inhaled.
Yeah, still don't. I live in Japan. But then having got the foot in the door, it was. I mean, I didn't even know my foot was in the door, but I kind of got asked. Me and Steve, let's write a fighting fantasy. And my problem was I didn't like game books. And I'd written in my fanzine a really critical review of Shadow in the Sand, which is Lone Wolf 5.
Yeah.
And I was really almost fascistic about it. I was a role player. Game books were not real role playing, and therefore they were rubbish. So now I was in the position that I was going to be writing one of them, which was kind of difficult. So we wrote
So your
Slaves.
principles meets money,
Well,
and the principles.
yeah, but no. But the funny thing was, no, they didn't, because I knew that I was being completely cynical and writing it for money. And I did Slaves to the Abyss, which is full of references to Gnosticism for no good reason.
Well, actually, I was going to say, I think we could just get a little bit geeky now, which would be quite fun, because those two books and Slaves to the Abyss all have quite a unique, different premise, and so I think they are addressing your concern about what game books were failing to do. And I'd quite like you to explain the basic premise of those two books, so we can understand.
Okay, well, actually, yeah. First, I will say, which has been pointed out here, is, and I don't think I was the first to do this, but I hated the idea of paragraph 400 being the success paragraph. Because almost all the books, I don't know, Talisman of Death, the same, paragraph 400 was success. And
Like with
this,
Where the Tiger, we decided we beat Fighting Fantasy by going to 425.
good for you. Right.
That's
Well,
better than Fighting
I
Fantasy.
hated this idea that as soon as you saw it turn to 400, you knew you'd won it.
Also, what is success?
Well, that we did, yeah, that came slightly later. But 400, I thought, well, the obvious thing to do is make that a death paragraph. And really enjoy it, relish it, because the pleasure of writing these books, as Jamie hinted earlier with his harpoon through the chest, is writing these paragraphs in which you die horribly.
Yeah.
So that was the first thing, and that was just the simplest of little tweaks that made me feel more comfortable with writing these books that I was ideologically opposed to. But each new book, I wasn't going to do it unless there was something unusual. So Black Vein Prophecy, actually that one was mostly Steve coming up. He liked this idea, being a twin.
Steve Jackson.
Steve Williams.
Oh, Steve Williams, of course.
Being a twin, he loved the idea of having a story that was about two twins. One of them was good and one of them was evil. I wonder which one Steve was.
Mm-hmm.
And but you wake up and you have no memory. So a lot of people say you stole that from Creature of Havoc, but I don't think Creature of Havoc had been published when we proposed that. I mean, it was published earlier, but we hadn't seen it.
The lead-in time for these books was often about 9 or 10 months.
Yeah, it's quite a lot.
So it took a long time
it took
from
us to write
delivery
it.
to publication.
Yeah. And then Crimson Tide, this I'm embarrassed about because we worked on Warlock, and all the letters we got from Warlock said, we love fighting fantasy books, we love the really difficult ones that are really challenging. So I was constantly thinking, how can I make these more difficult? In Crimson Tide, I came up with this idea that why not have the option not be written anywhere in the book? That's kind of more difficult. So actually, to get to the success paragraph in Crimson Tide, it is nowhere written in the book. What happens is you get keywords, which is a common kind of mechanic, and then there's a little puzzle, numerical puzzle, which you have to solve, and you write that down, and that's the paragraph number. So basically, if you get the right thing, you get this set of instructions written on your character sheet that tells you an extra option you can take. And I thought this was so clever, and I now think it's the most stupid thing imaginable.
Although that does slightly remind me, the second Golden Dragon book,
Oh yeah.
the Temple of Flame, I wanted to make it that there was no option that got you to the victory point, that you had to think a little bit laterally. So there's actually a point close to the end where the bad guy duplicates an exact copy of you, and you have to have a fight with that copy, and then you have to fight the bad guy, which you would think, well, how's that going to work? Because I'll be dead at the end of the first fight, 50-50. But it says it duplicates your exact stats at this moment, and you have a few moments to prepare for the battle. And earlier on, you've got a couple of healing potion options. So the trick is, you should probably be near to death at the moment you first face him. He duplicates you, you drink the healing potion, you're at full stats, you easily beat your duplicate, but that's not something you could work out from just the flowchart. You have to think
the problem with that
outside
is,
the flowchart.
I would never do anything like that, because I always worked on the basis that the people who played these games were like me and cheated. And that is another reason why I made them so ludicrously difficult, because I had no patience to roll dice in stupid battles or any of that kind of thing. So I cheated. So I'm afraid all my books are written on the basis that readers cheat.
Yeah, I guess.
I mean, why shouldn't you? It's your book, and you want to start again, just go back.
You're only cheating yourself.
Yeah.
Well,
Next one.
Next one. Oh God, no, they're embarrassing.
No, okay. Because before you say anything, I was going to say Robin of Sherwood was a big influence on Dragon Warriors, and I just want to say we constantly play the Clanad music when we're playing, even to this day. If we're playing Legend, the Clanad music comes on, and that's part of the whole thing. But
and I will mention that the idea behind these game books, and it was terrible timing because this was a great TV show.
I'm sorry, it's Jason Connery, by the way. I couldn't get a Michael Praed.
There wasn't a Michael Praed.
No,
Yeah, we were sorry that we couldn't get a Michael Praed because we were writing based on the Michael Praed one. But the problem was this TV show had finished and the game books came out, and this is why nothing ever happened, because it was a dead television show. And our goal in writing these things, our aim, was to make a role-playing game. So if you actually look at this game book, it isn't really a game book system. It's a role-playing game system. And that's why it has these little pictures of the people you fight, and it has hit location. It's a role-playing system. So our goal was to write a few of these books, and when it became popular, say, oh, and here's the underlying system, and you can play your own role-playing based on Robin of Sherwood. And it never happened, unfortunately. And the third...
Gail's Arm, by the way.
That's what? That's Gail's Arm, right, great. The third author of this, it was me and Graham Staplehurst, and we actually co-wrote it, but there's enough names on this cover, so we just put one on each one. The third author was actually Mark Gascoigne, who oversaw the end of Fighting Fantasy, and unfortunately was cancelled before he ever had a chance to write one.
He was Brexit Minister in charge of Fighting Fantasy.
He was Brexit. Okay. He was a Brexit Minister for Fighting Fantasy. And here we go, the best game book ever written.
Well,
I published it briefly.
the point, these were originally virtual reality books that I did with Mark Smith, and the idea behind them, although they came out in the early 90s, it was to remove all of the dice, because we kept thinking, if you're on a bus or a train, and a lot of kids bought these books, how are they going to play this? You've got to have a pencil, you've got to have dice. So we just said, let's cut it right back to almost a novel with branching choices, but not to make it choose your own adventure, which is a bit too simplistic, but to still feel there's some gameplay, but without actually having dice. So it's all based on skills. You pick 4 skills from a list of 12 in every book, and they're different for each setting. So you've got about 500 different characters, possible characters, and the idea was it's winnable with any one of those characters. I don't think Min got that memo, Mark, because he just said, I said, you can't win this book unless you've taken fighting skill. He goes, why would anyone not take fighting skill if they didn't want to be a fighter, for example? So I had to go through and add some options to his books to make sure they were still playable. But
you also had alternative endings. This is something
there
I
were
stole,
multiple endings.
that I dealt with my books, and particularly with Mage Hunter, which I think came out after this.
Probably, yeah.
I liked the idea that there were different levels of ending, and to me, the real ending of Heart of Ice is the same ending as the original Blade Runner movie, which is the lift doors closed.
But it has to be said that all endings in Heart of Ice are homages to Blade Runner. But,
right. But the real one is the lift door.
Yeah, no, the real one is the lift door. But the point of Heart of Ice is one of the choices you're making is what are you willing to do for power, and how much are you a hero, and how much is being a hero just about wanting glory rather than to do good. And because I'm a role player, I don't feel it's my job to tell you what the right thing to do in life is. I want to present them all as options, and all of those endings are reachable. So people say to me, what's the right ending of Heart of Ice? And you can have your right ending, and I might even have mine, but it's up to the player. And in fact, I've added another ending to the latest edition.
Oh, yeah.
Yet another Blade Runner homage. But so there is about 5 different possible endings, depending on what, and they could all be the right ending, depending on what moral course or ethical course you've decided to.
I have to say, this is the only game book that my wife has played and thinks is brilliant. She really loved it.
My wife hasn't played it, but yeah.
I proofread it.
She proofread
Edited.
Lucy hasn't played it.
No, she would never play a game.
No, but if you ever play any game book, that's the one to play. That's a Manta Sky card, by the way. Just to say. So at the time I was doing that, Jamie and Mark had come up with this really innovative idea, the Dual Master book. So
And you played the Dual Master books?
Yes.
Oh, that's good. Weirdly, I had that idea whilst I was having acupuncture. I was having acupuncture
to the brain.
for various reasons, and I came up with
I
the
was
idea.
doing the acupuncture.
Yeah. For some reason, I started thinking about the whole system that we used for these game books, 2-player game books, and I had the mirror image of the 2 books and all these different. I was trying to think about how you could make this work, and it meant having to make sure that each player, both readers, were on the same paragraph before they turned on. So you had a kind of weight system before you could both say whatever the paragraph number was, and they were pretty complicated and very different as well.
It's the nearest I've come to being a fan, because I got the first one, Challenge of the Magi, was it?
Challenge of the Magi.
And I played that with a friend of mine. He had a cold, and I said, let's, you look pretty miserable, let's play this game book. He was like, oh, well, we could both play it. It's like we play against each other. And we played it, for a few hours. And we were going, this is so good, we've got to get another one. And we walked to the local bookshop and found, remarkably, that they had another book in the series. And I was sitting there going, I don't even know how Jamie, I assumed it wasn't Mark who worked it out. I said, I don't even know how Jamie has done it. It's so remarkable that you would be playing the book and knew what the other player was doing.
Yes.
So they really were good.
And that worked because there were mirror images of themselves. There were various little tricks that you could use, game booking tricks, to make them match. And that was also true of book 3, which was about nations at war. And I can't remember what book 4 was. Oh, the Arena of Death. So that was also gladiators fighting in a fantasy arena. But book 2 was called Blood Valley. And one of you was like an evil archrevolt, and the barbarian slave escapes from the pits.
The balance wasn't so good.
Yeah, we didn't get the balance right. That's because each book was different. Because in one book, in all the other books, you're either one side of a civil war, or you're 2 different magicians, or you're 2 gladiators. In this, you were the big winged bad guy demon hunting the barbarian on the run.
But that's one of the very interesting things, because it was one of the best premises from a story point of view, because it was unbalanced.
So I'd be
that made
hunting
it a difficult
you,
thing to be
and you, or you'd be hunting me. But it made it really
hard.
hard.
It hard to do as a game.
Yeah, we got that wrong, so it's really hard to win.
By the way, the covers, really good to say about the covers.
Well, they're the covers.
Josh Kirby did.
Yeah, who did all of the.
He did the Terry Pratchett.
Yeah.
They're wrong. I think it's the wrong style.
Yeah, I guess so.
It's a bit too.
But it didn't matter too much, because at the end of the day, the whole 2-player game book experiment didn't do very well. Because at the end of the day, you sit at home and you read a game book on your own. It's not really, 2-player, a board game, a card game.
Yeah, maybe the problem is that we're role players writing game books.
Right.
So we imagine you want to do it with somebody else.
Same thing with Bloodsword. I thought people would want to get together with their friends. Turned out a lot of game book people didn't even have another friend who would read a game book. Anyway,
So what's the next one?
this was inspiration. Some of our inspirations for something.
Yes. For Fable Lands.
Right. So Eric Goldberg did the Tales of the Arabian Nights board game. Brilliant. I think there's a new edition. We played a lot of Might and Magic, particularly Tales of the Arabian Nights. One of the things that's really good about it is the very compressed prose style, because we've been talking about, and we'll come on to this, talking about a big open world gamebook series for some time. But it was fine, if you did normal gamebook style writing, you couldn't get enough paragraphs in. And Goldberg kind of pointed the way how very elegantly, in 2 or 3 sentences, you could communicate an entire country. You know, you could reach a city, and he would just use this very elegant, pared down language. It was quite,
To step back a bit, so everything that we've done today, we were talking about before, were all these game books, and we tried to innovate in different ways. And then finally, Dave and I came up with the idea of the Fabled Lands, and this was completely new. Open world, yes, open world of doing game books. So we wanted to really try and make a computer game without a computer, kind of like a Might and Magic thing.
So each of these books is a complete, you know, it's a geographic section of the world.
So that bit there, that's book 1, that's book 2, that's book 3, that's up top is book 4, that's book 5 and book 6. And the point being that if I'm reading in book 1 and I say I want to get a boat to this over here, you turn to paragraph 342 in book 4 or book 5 or whatever. So you end up with all these books that are interconnected all together. There's no single one overarching storyline. And not only that, the world reacts to what you do. So we had these code words and tick boxes. So if you went back to the same city many times, after a while it would be different. And if, for instance, you killed a bandit in his lair, the next time you went back, maybe there'd be the ghost of the bandit waiting for you. So we wanted to give the feeling that you were affecting the world and the world was reacting to you around you. And we did things like you could do anything you wanted. So you could decide whose side you wanted to join in a civil war. You could buy a boat and trade across the ocean, buying and selling. It was like really new, and I thought that was the greatest thing we ever did game book wise in terms of systems. So far. We're not that old yet. Yeah.
So yeah, Kevin Jenkins did the covers, these beautiful triptych widescreen covers, which actually financially crippled the series because they were too expensive to produce the folder.
Yeah.
But Russ's pictures are just so much fun. And I've got to say, Russ doesn't just do the pictures. We get together, so he'll talk about ideas like a city that walks, and that feeds back into what we write about. So Russ has never just been the guy who just illustrates what we talk about. He's creatively fed in a lot of stuff.
That reminds me about how Russ sent us a bit of a map he'd been working on. And he said, I'm terribly sorry, I've spilt some ink on it. And there was a big splash of ink, and we went, the hole in the world. That became the storyline that we put in. It was actually just an ink blot.
That's fun. I'm just going to talk about these because these guys don't get enough credit. They're called Clone Front. They're an art collective, mostly Hungarian artists. They did all these beautiful redraws of Russ's pictures for Fabled Lands, and I think they weren't commissioned by us. They were commissioned by somebody else who ended up not paying them. So we've got all this artist just there. I think in the end they did manage to sell it, but really it's such great work. They deserve to have been much better credited for that.
So these are all black and white Russ pictures that they've just done great.
Yeah, they've just done really. I mean, Russ's originals are still much better. Like this is a great example. That, although that looks very dramatic, if you look at Russ's original, the pose of the guy in the boat is pure fear, whereas they're just the emotion. I mean, it's executed beautifully, but Russ takes it to another level, really, as an artist. Anyway, so Keep of the Lich-Lord, one of our fighting fantasies that's come back as a Fabled Lands book.
Yes, we've adapted it, or Dave adapted it from a fighting fantasy setting into a Fabled Lands setting. Because the Fabled Lands is such a huge world, you can just slot stuff in there. It's not, because it's non-linear, and a series of never-ending adventures that you can play over and over. And you have character classes, so you can choose to be what kind of character you want, and then you'll get specific missions that happen in the game based on whether you're a fighter or a magician or a cleric kind of thing.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure about this idea of Fabled Lands Quest, because it's effectively putting a linear adventure into the open structure of Fabled Lands. But it means if you come to a particular place, in this case Dwemer, I think, in that city, you can pick up this quest, and then you go on that quest. But that, when you're in that, you're in a traditional game book, and then you come back into the Fabled Lands world. I do think it's better than the original Fighting Fantasy book, because there were some areas where we had things like you meet some elves or something, and in the new version, you actually meet some exiled Utakin insurgents, and it gives you a new gloss on another part of the Fabled Lands universe. So I think it works much better as a sort of role-playing supplement, as it were, in its new version. But and we were thinking of taking Castle of Lost Souls, the thing I did for White Dwarf all those years ago, because it was done in 4 instalments. We could put it into Golnir in Fabled Lands, but have a code word that told you which instalment you'd done. So instead of having to go off, like in this case, do the whole of the Keep of the Lich Lord and then come back into Fabled Lands world, this would be a thing where you go to a part of Golnir, do 1 instalment, and then if you want, get back into wandering all over the Fabled Lands, come back to Golnir, go to this town and pick up the next instalment, and that might still be something we'll do. And this is the latest Fabled Lands book, which we funded on Kickstarter, written by Paul Gresty.
And that's book 7, and we're hoping to do another one, book 8. So the Fabled Lands are coming back again because there's a renewed interest, and there's a whole bunch of guys like you. So when you were kids, you loved them, and now you've got families and jobs, and you want to buy all these old retro game books and hopefully read them to your children so that they're also play them. It was interesting because there was a period in like the late 90s, early 2000s where game books were pretty much dead. Completely. They've really come back recently. Not in the same way they used to, but
this is one of Leo Hartas's maps for, this is for Keep of the Lich Lord. Of course he's famous from Fighting Fantasy. Another one of our sort of little clique of people that we know.
But it actually, I remember he started in White Dwarf, and I still remember, it was when I was there, and I still remember we got our first map from Leo Hartas at White Dwarf, and Ian Marsh and I, we both looked at it and said, this is brilliant, this is what all our maps have to be like.
Well, actually,
there were pictures.
I'm going to tell the story about how Leo got involved in this, because I turned up as I did with my, you know, as we've seen, my vodka and my Sanritz, and I arrived at the offices 10 o'clock one morning. There's a young guy who's laid all of his art on the floor, and it was the day before you're due to go to press, so nobody had time to look at this, and everyone's coming into the office stepping over his art, and I was looking at it going, this is great stuff, and he was explaining it all, and Jamie was having to look at that but also deal with all the proofs coming in, and it was, so there just wasn't time to really give this guy attention. I was thinking, this is heartbreaking, because I knew he'd come up from the south coast, he mentioned that, and only a couple of weeks later, I got the Golden Dragon contract. So my first game book, and the editor said, do you have an artist in mind? It's like, that guy I met at Games Workshop. And I happened to be going down to the south coast that weekend. So I phoned up Jamie and I said, that guy that was in your office, Leo something, you got his telephone number? And Jamie said, I had it on a scrap of paper in my jeans, but I put them in the washing machine. So I said, well, I'll wait. And he said, oh, I can just about read it. It's, you know, having taken it out of my pocket, and it's like, it's a bit blurred. And I got the number, and I phoned up Leo, and he only lived about 5 miles away. So I said, come and have a coffee, and we'll talk about you doing the art. And he's one of my closest friends. His son is my godson. We've done loads of projects together since then. He's famous for his fighting fantasy. But all of that started because you didn't put washing machine on too high a temperature, which is, you know,
well, I'm amazed I washed my trousers in the first
place. I know. But even you had a washing machine is amazing.
Yeah.
So, and this is Russ's map for the new Fabled Lands. Again, absolutely, Russ is a fabulous artist. And isn't that just beautiful? I mean, it's like when I was a kid looking at the maps in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and you immediately want to go adventuring. So Russ really gets that.
So each book in the Fabled Lands series had a kind of theme. So book 1 and 2 were kind of medievally European, and book 3 was sort of piratey seas. Book 4 was like kind of Plains Indians meets Mongols kind of thing. Genghis Khan meets Geronimo kind of stuff. And book 5 was completely weird and made up.
Which is why it's the best.
Yeah, maybe. And I based that kind of on the Ottoman court. So the Ottoman court of the 19th century had weird things like there was a master of nightingales, and he would just look after the nightingales of the sultan. And the most powerful man who wasn't a sultan at one point was the chef, because he had FaceTime with the sultan. He'd go to him and say, "How do you like your kebabs today, my lord? Will you make my brother the emir of Aleppo," or whatever, that kind of thing. So it was incredibly complicated and strange setup, and I married that with a kind of inquisitorial fundamentalist religion, because when we were writing those, Islam wasn't what we think of it, what it is like now. Well, that's very unfair, but there weren't those kind of guys at the time. So Islam in the West was Arabian Nights, by the beard of the Prophet, that kind of thing, not die infidel die. But
although I don't think of the critique, as it were, in Book 5 to be of Islam. It's of all dogma, all dogma of any kind.
Inquisitorial.
When you belong to any society where you can, it could be 1984.
So there's one bit where you cross a bridge into the country, and it's a particular date, and they ask you, what kind of scarf are you wearing? And if you're wearing a spotted scarf on the wrong day, that's a religious fine, and you could be, it's that kind of thing in the Faber Lands books. It's called comedy stuff.
Oh yeah, so Frankenstein. So I did this.
I was going to say book 6 was sort of Japanese-y kind of thing, and
well, Thai as well.
So book 7 is sort of South American, isn't it? Aztec.
Frankenstein, a little bit different because it was for iPad, which meant that I could do lots of conditional text. So one example is the whole book isn't you. It's not second person. You're doing this. It's Frankenstein himself is narrating it. So he'll say, "I want your advice," and you're his conscience in some way, and you can push him one way or another. So you can either kind of help him to be a better person, or you can encourage him to greater heights of hubris. But an example of the conditional text is a very early decision you may make is whether you encourage him to think of the creature he's created as human or a monster. And that decision that you make very early on in the book affects the entire rest of the book as to whether the monster is called it or he, which means that it has an ongoing massive emotional effect on how you see the monster, the creature, whether you've demonized it or not. And the stats, which are all hidden from you, are things like trust and guilt and pride. So I wanted it to be like a game book makes a relationship between the reader and the narrator, and something that would be very hard to do in print, because as soon as you saw that you've increased trust by 3%, you would know it was a game. Whereas in this, he'll simply suddenly say to you things like, "I don't think I'm going to do what you just suggested. You keep giving me bad advice," because he's lost trust in me. So it was interesting to experiment with a different medium, because there are totally different approaches to how you write it.
Because that's Dave's idea of how to have a conversation with the character that used to be you in game books. And moved us on to ideas where we're talking about now of you play a kind of god talking to this character. It probably would be an Egyptian. It's a bit like the mummy, so it's a reborn Imhotep. But you've got to decide whether you're going to be Set or Osiris. And that the way you try to guide the character through conversations with him, and he or her, and they may not follow what you suggest. So it's a slightly different way of doing game books, which is kind of
because I think an early form of game books was always you are the hero, and it just became like nobody questioned whether that's the only way, and there are so many other things you could do. I mean, they could be third person, but I think that's too authorial and distancing. You know, he does this, what do you want him to do now? That's like, that, you're not engaged. But I think first person could be a very strong...
And the other way we looked at it is you're the voices in the head of the character, for another thing we're working on. So the main character that is a bit mad, but you, as the reader, play his mad voices.
Well, in Frankenstein, for example, Frankenstein addresses you as if you're his companion, as you're walking around. But there are a couple of scenes where he's talking to you, and other third-person characters are saying, "Who are you talking to?" So it's clear that you're basically Tyler Durden to Victor Frankenstein in this. Is going in Fight Club?
Fight Club.
Oh, of course, right, yeah.
So what's the next? Okay, you can talk about this.
What, me? You wrote most of
It enrages me too much as a subject.
See, it's got Dave Morris on top in big letters and me in the bottom because he did most of it. To be fair, he did do about 90% of it. But the idea of can you
Jamie
Brexit...
did a 10 good percent of it, though.
Yes, the best bits, obviously.
Oh, I like Tim. You've got Tim Harford at the top.
Yeah, I got a Tim Harford.
yeah.
He's another of our role-playing companions and friends.
But he's also has a radio show on BBC, so it's become a topic. He earns far more money than we do. I once paid him a pittance to write 50 paragraphs in the Fable Lands book, and now he writes best-selling economics books that get sold in the Times.
He's done 2 TED Talks as well.
Yeah, and TV stuff. But anyway, can you Brexit? The premise is you're the Prime Minister of Britain, and you've got to handle
Well, we probably
Brexit.
ought to explain, if you haven't heard of Brexit or Britain. We're a small country off the coast of Europe, and we have a problem because we used to have a huge empire and we can't get over that we lost it. So we constantly get enraged about anybody else that's running a club that we don't feel we're running. And recently, a bunch of morons in our country have decided to vote that we should leave the EU. By the way, nothing to do with Londoners. We voted to stay in the EU, but in rural areas there are a lot of strange people. And so they're steering us towards the cliffside, but there we go.
And the premise is
Not that I'm partial or anything.
It's not. I mean, you can leave with. You can stop Brexit, but basically the whole premise is you're the Prime Minister, and your goal is to stay in power. And it's just like reality, basically, and no matter what the cost, you have to keep the EU happy, and your mad Brexiters happy, and your Remainers happy. It's a really well-researched, very clever book, mostly done by Dave.
By the way, we were thinking of applying for political asylum in Germany while we're here.
Yes.
So bear that in
And
mind.
we've created a bunch of, I don't know how well you know, any of you know who Farage is? He's like a mad...
It's like
Brexit.
Marine Le Pen in Britain,
Yes,
but a
yeah.
kind of
So-
even stupider version.
How successful was the book in Britain?
Well,
Well, that's interesting.
not really.
Our agent sent it out before Christmas, and about 30 publishers came back saying this is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
And after Christmas, they all came back going, we've all talked about it, and we don't think the readers are interested in Brexit. So for some reason, they had gone from this is brilliant to we don't want to handle it.
But we created names of all of these characters, so Farage has become...
Fungal.
And then you might enjoy, you know who Boris Johnson is? The mad foreign secretary. So we call him Peter Struhl, which is from Struhl-headed Peter, from German... Yeah. And yeah, so anyway, it's a kind of satire of Brexit, but it's also very well researched, so you learn a lot about how bad Brexit will be, basically, because
And
there's
another
no
thing,
good thing about it.
didn't really want to write it, other than, because it was just I either go on Facebook and rant, or I thought, this would be, had the idea of doing it as a game, but I thought we could do this. But the thing that had bothered me was that it needed to have a passage of time. So there's a turn counter built into it. The way the turn counter works is sort of tick boxes like in Fabled Lands, which record whether you've been to a section. And there's a section which was originally called turn counter. It's like section 200 now. But it's got 4 tick boxes. And you're often routed back there, and the number of boxes ticked tells us, are you in, of the 4 6-month periods between announcing Article 50 and leaving the EU, which of those 4 periods are you in? So if you go back there, very often you don't add a tick. It just says how many ticks are here, and it tells you where to go. But if you've gone through all of the briefings and all of the actions you might take, you come to a paragraph that goes, go to turn counter and add a tick. And at that point, it ticks on. Turn counter means that whenever you go back there, it now knows you're in the second section. So it was it's quite difficult in print to figure how can we get this to do what a computer would do, which would be so simple if it wasn't a print
Also,
thing.
it's interesting how some of the stuff that happens in the book has started to happen in real life.
Second
it's really
referendum,
hard
we
to,
hadn't had that yet.
it's really hard to survive without a leadership challenge. But anyway, that's the Can You Brexit book.
So is there a happy ending?
Well, I don't...
Well, actually, yes, it's possible to stop Brexit, but it's like a
remain
hidden
in power.
paragraph. It's quite hard to get to, but you can do it. But the really hard thing is you can't go straight for it, because if you do that, your party won't... It's all about party politics. The reason this is going on now is the Conservative Party in Britain has an extreme right, they say Eurosceptic, but Europhobic wing, And they are destabilising the government, which means the government is pushing this increasingly insane version of Brexit. And you can't go straight for saying, we're not going to Brexit, because you would immediately be out of power. You have to do it by stealth, but you can do it. If the government only read this book, they could fix everything tomorrow.
And hopefully they would read Fabled Lands too.
Yeah. What next?
Well, I don't know really.
Have a look.
Well,
This is Russ, again.
Yes.
Pictures, the concept art that Russ has done. Next one.
We've got various ideas for Kickstarters for new game book types of things, which 5 years ago we weren't even thinking about. But now, because we can do Kickstarters for new Where the Tigers and Fabled Lands, we've just got all these ideas. This one is started off as The King in Shadow, and the idea was that Dracula wins, and all of London has been turned into a vampire kind of Victorian.
There's a video game.
Yeah.
The Order 18.
Yeah. So we had this idea in 1997. Some other bastards have already done
Yeah.
it. So, yeah. So we're trying to think
We couldn't
about.
possibly do it now as Dracula because it's been done, Anna Dracula
maybe,
from
yeah,
one thing.
yeah.
And also, why do it as
But it
this
was great
Victorian
because
thing?
David did all these things like Sherlock Holmes has been turned into a vampire, and he wakes up and he's like. But yeah,
It would have been great if we did it in '97, but you know, looking back at it, we've got to. I want to turn it into something more like The King in Yellow, so it's a little bit Cthulhu. I mean, not Cthulhu specifically, because I slightly object to people ripping off H.P. Lovecraft. They're all making a lot of money, but at the time he didn't make any money, and it feels a little bit cheap to just go, hey, it's great that he's dead and we don't have to pay him anything, because he died in poverty. So I kind of think we've got to. But and nonetheless, he's a leader of ideas. So something of that existential horror that H.P. Lovecraft pioneered, without just actually just ripping off his mythos, would be a good way to go, I think.
So we're sort of going back to looking at game books.
Yeah. And then there was going to be maybe Fablelands 8, you mentioned.
Oh yes, we'll probably
And-
do Fablelands.
But I wanted to bring it back to the start, because recently, we're talking about how Jamie got his, start at Games Workshop from his mum, and he was clearing out his mum's attic, and he found a lost duel. So tell us.
Yeah, I found that Duel Master 7, no 5. How many are there? Duel Master 5 I'd already written years ago. I'd forgotten I had it.
Duel Master.
And it's called Masters of the Martial Arts, so it's like the Arena of Death, but it's all kung fu stuff. So I just found an entire 2-player game book. It needs some updating because it was a bit rushed. In those days it would be like, how do you write game books? And people ask me, and the way I used to do them, when Dave would ring me and say, we've got 2 weeks before the publisher. What the fuck? I'm going to turn Doom off. So master this 2-player game was a bit rushed, but with a little bit of work, we could have another 2-player game book. And I was kind of thinking that there wouldn't be much interest. I don't know, would you pledge for a Kickstarter for that? I mean, there are guys that we talked to that said they probably would, but I'm not sure about 2-player game books.
Would it be possible to republish the Duel Master?
Yes, but we need to raise some money to do the art. I mean, the first 4 books we can do, but like Fabled Lands 7, we had to get, when we've republished the Fabled Lands books ourselves, but we had to get money to pay the artists and the covers, and for Fabled Lands 7 we had to do a Kickstarter so we could raise money for.
I mean,
Falcon's
a good example, because I think the Falcon books are great, time travel books. They weren't very popular at the time, but I don't think they got the coverage. They're really interesting. They're not a Doctor Who type of time travel. They're more of a kind of Johnny Alpha time travel. If you mashed up 2000 AD with time travel, that's what you get. And so I think they're really interesting. But we did the first one, but we've got to scan them. We've got to typeset them. We've got to edit them to make sure that the scanning didn't miss anything. We've got to get new art. Well, luckily, Peter Andrew Jones was willing to remaster his cover for us. So we did all that for the first book. And nobody was interested, which means the second, we can't do more books. So it's finding, if there's a market, we'll do the books, but is there going to be interest? I think the Duel Master books are great too, but usually as a benchmark, if I think something's brilliant, nobody else likes it. So that might be the problem.
Well, Kickstarter is a special ecosystem.
Yeah.
I think a lot of projects don't really produce something people consume. They just buy into the Kickstarter, they put it on a shelf, and they feel great because it reminds them of their childhood and all the things they wanted to do. So if you would do a Kickstarter about a topic that has been quite popular in the past, there will probably be a market for this, because nowadays we are rich enough to afford all the things we couldn't have when we were small.
So exactly. So that's probably the way that we do it.
So I think you could market this with this in your in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
Buying number 5 of something I can't buy number 1 to 4. Well, it wouldn't have much appeal.
Yes, that's
because it would look very, very odd on my shelf. How about part 1 and 4? Well, that's something we don't talk about.
You're right, Charles. That's okay.
So we should do the Kickstarter is to republish the first
All of
4, and we'll do a new one.
And create a stretch goal. If you go to the 100,000 euros level, you will have
100,000.
Yeah, no, you won't see us again if we get to
I like the sound of 100,000
Yeah.
euros. Yeah.
100 is right. We got to about 30 or 40,000 with the Fableland 7, so it can be done. But, And the other thing I wanted to show you, which isn't on there, I don't think, is that all the log?
The photo?
Yeah, which I think might
a bit
be
more complicated. So
Yeah.
You want a web page?
No, it should be. If you copied everything over to the folder.
No, I didn't.
You've
No,
got
you
to
didn't.
get
I'll
your
put
USB out.
my special USB.
It's a demon, right?
Yeah, well, skull USB, and stick that into where's your USB?
Left hand, right hand.
Do you want to run a McAfee just as he's doing that?
What?
No, it's my work computer.
Okay.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, it's already put a virus in immediately. It's now going to hijack everything that you have.
Yeah, but you got it wrong because my computer's going to virus your.
Ah, yeah.
Are we on there? Hang on, no, USB.
Yeah, there we are. And then tick on GW 1983. So this is, if it comes up.
It will do eventually. It's just Windows 10 takes its time.
There you go.
Oh yeah, Windows 10 virus.
Oh no, it's not showing.
Yeah, Windows 10 is a virus. Yeah. There we go.
Why is it not?
Oh, is it not showing?
No.
That's a good point. Why is that not showing?
Still got the other thing running in the background.
Oh, yeah, maybe. No, I quit that.
Can you drag it over onto the...
Yeah, maybe.
It looks great. I wish you guys could see it.
Hang on, I need to duplicate the windows, don't I?
Ah.
Or actually, hang on, maybe I can drag it. Yeah.
Oh, there we are, okay. So this is 1983, a Games Workshop staff thing. You see here, these two unknown blokes.
Steve Jackson.
Steve Jackson and Livingston. There's JB the man.
Oh, good God. I told you we were going to kick that over and you kicked a different one over.
There's Joe Diva, looking very young, yeah. And there's Gary Chalk.
Looking very young as well.
Over there, any of you know John Sutherland from a bunch of game books he did? And then there's also an Ian Bailey and a Clive Bailey who did a bunch of game books too. And the people missing there.
Oh, the Darvers!
Oh, Peter Darvel Evans, who did, what was the Vampire one, was it?
Yeah, he did all the Doctor Who books. He was the
Oh,
editor
and the
of all
Doctor Who books, yeah. And then the ones missing there are Simon Farrell and Paul Mason and Ian Marsh, who came along later. But there you can see how the whole game book thing pretty much came out of Games Workshop in 1983. Yeah.
Apart from Mark Smith, Oliver Johnson and Dave Morris.
Yeah, well, they're not really important.
You got Games Workshop hangers on.
Yeah.
I don't think
You were just clever enough never to actually be
So
able
they
to
didn't actually work for Games Workshop, or they were connected to Games Workshop in some way. Yeah. And I asked her out. She turned me down. I did go out with her. It didn't, yeah, I asked her too. It didn't really work out. She ended up marrying him. Yeah.
What about her? Not interested?
Which one?
Any of them?
She was married to Malcolm, a huge giant who lived around the warehouse. Poor old Albie Fiore.
Oh, that's Albie. Albie's a genius.
Yeah,
He did a lot of early Talisman and Games Workshop board games. He's dead now.
Yeah.
He smoked like a trooper.
Yeah. He could actually lay stuff out on the old Linotron machines.
Yeah.
It wasn't like desktop publishing is now. I mean, that took real skill. These things were typesetting machines where you didn't have like a WYSIWYG, you didn't see what you got. But he would actually lay, I think Golden Heroes, he laid out on the Linotron machine. Genius.
So that just goes to show where it all started in England, and then all the rest of the world had their own versions. Anyway, there you go, that's our game book talk. Anyone got any questions?
No.
Maybe you could ask, where do I buy a Fabled Lands book?
or a Dark Lord.
A signed one.
Yeah, we'll sign them, of course. Yeah.
There are young upcoming authors too, like Sven Haller tried to make accompanying, but you weren't so much interested, so I'm not sure if you if it's a moment, or is it just a thing because you are on your own level and don't need to take the chance to get new ideas and look at the projects of other people, because he's very brilliant. He has done very thick and he has a lot of ideas which you talked about, made up on his own and without knowing your ideas, came up all on his own. He put out his all brilliant layout, he made riddles so complicated, he did it over
He had the
3
luxury
years.
of being able to do
Yeah,
big books.
it's really, he's really,
Sven.
he's
He's
really talented, and
He's
I
got
think-
to die.
Yeah, you can see it as
Don't
a
need any
concurrent,
more
but
company,
you can the positive way to see him as a son or
No,
something.
he's a genius. As soon as I saw
No, he's
Yeah,
a competitor.
his heavy metal
Probably
one, I thought,
you both
like,
can,
yeah.
you both can profit from each other, because he has some what I say for the newer generations, and you have a lot of experience which you say, oh, we tried this 90s and 80s and
absolutely.
and
The more people working in any area, the
and I
better.
think
because
if
they have
if you're
innovation.
doing on the broader side, like a think tank or something like that, it would be brilliant. You would make such great game books, which.
Well, another series I like, a new series, is called Steam Highwayman by Martin Nooch, and he's taken the Fabled Lands concept, but Fabled Lands is completely free. You're basically thrown in to pick whatever you want to be. But a lot of people say, I find there's too much freedom. I want to know what I'm supposed to do. And Martin has found a halfway house between a fighting fantasy book and Fabled Lands by saying, your character is a highwayman in a steampunk world. He has a steam motorcycle, and he's trying to stop he's trying to rob from the rich. Got a little bit of Robin Hood, but rather like Robin Hood. Is he a nobleman who's fighting back? Is he a peasant who's trying to bring down the nobility that are the people who are oppressing him? You get to decide that. So you get to decide your motivation and everything, but you still have a role given to you. Just not, you get to decide why you're in that role. So he's giving you the amount of freedom, much more freedom than you would get in Fighting Fantasy, but less than you would get in Fabled Lands. And he's also constrained the area much more. So whereas Fabled Lands book covers an entire nation, he's made it one county, so one district. And it's a district he knows personally very well from having lived there, around Marlow in southeast England. So it's very steeped in a particular, and also he's drawn a lot on the author Keith Roberts, who wrote Pavane and some other steampunk stuff back in the 70s and 80s. So it's very rich, and I look at something like that and think it's great because it's obviously based on Fabled Lands, the whole system and everything, but it's like, now I can learn from him. So the more people who do stuff, definitely the better that is.
Yeah, well, Dave says that. I've just realised the name of my next game book. Sven Must Die.
And he actually, just one addition. On his last one, I don't know if it's already coming out in English. It's called Metal Heroes and the
that's the one I saw.
Yeah, that's really
that's
good.
where
Comedy metal. He has this idea which you were talking about, and without knowing it, and
so you've got to try and start a metal band.
You've got to start a metal band.
It's
Rock.
really funny.
And it's genius because as soon as I saw that cover, it was like, Yes, obviously. You know, and those are the ideas.
Yeah,
You know, where you go, wham, obviously.
so probably you should do some project together and it would go bam through the... Because
Well, he can do all the work and we'll
As Jamie
we'll take the money. And when he complains, we'll put him in the pie.
Well, one of the problems we had back in the 80s and 90s was that publishers didn't really want a lot of innovation. They wanted to be able to say something like, oh, this has this new thing, but they didn't want it to be really innovative. Because if you meddle, they were already making so much money with every game book they did, that it's like, why would you meddle? So if I said, what about first person? They'd go, why would we just do a game book? Fighting Fantasy didn't really want you to meddle with the formula. And the trouble was that that formula becomes increasingly boring. I think if they'd been more open to innovation in the late 80s, early 90s, game books wouldn't have crashed as a genre for so long.
I will say, when I started writing game books and we went in and met the people there, everybody who worked for Puffin, all the people I talked to, they were British upper-class women who were interested in books about ponies. Right? That was what they were interested in. And it was, you would try to explain something to you about the game book, and their eyes would glaze over before you'd even opened your mouth. And so they then got in a guy called Richard Scrivener, and it was clear that he was the guy that they only got in because they simply didn't want to. They knew that game books made a lot of money, but they simply didn't want to have to deal with them. And you know, that was the way it was working.
To get back
and in the later days of Fighting Fantasy, you'd have these great innovations. Like I remember getting the call from Mark Gascoigne, it may have been Scrivener himself, saying, "Oh, and we've decided to cut the number of paragraphs to 300." Why? Oh, well, we've just decided it. It'll make them better. And as was pointed out to me quite correctly yesterday, it was nice to hear it. No, obviously more paragraphs is what the fans are going to like more. But they didn't care about that. It was like 300 paragraphs, shorter book, cheaper.
Yeah. Splitting a story into different books, like the Lone Wolf series, where you can play the same character along with his tank.
That's
way too sophisticated.
We did that in Where the Tiger. So Where the Tiger, you've got the same character all the way through.
So,
but no, Fighting
Fantasy Falcon as well.
Never going to do that.
So apart from going to conventions and having things like this today, well, this is obviously like pouring water into a river, because we love game books. You're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
So what are your ideas, or do you have plans to make your books, your work more popular for people that never got involved with role-playing?
One thing we're looking at is whether we could get some game books onto a platform like Alexa. So you would be actually... Because after all, one of the things that puts people off is the effort. Right? You've got to lean forward to play a book.
Yeah.
So if you could just go, Alexa, start the Castle of Lost Souls, and you get a bit of narration as what would you like to do now? We'll go into the swamp, and you get the next bit.
It's Fist all over again.
Well, it's just making things available to casual players. Because we're used to, because of the wargaming origins of role-playing and game books, we're used to the idea of, here are some dice, you have to add some numbers together. I'm constantly baffled when you see an app that replicates a game book, where it says things like, add your skill, and the dice you just rolled, and something else. It's like, what are you talking about? Why are you doing this? I mean, why are you asking players to do all that stuff?
I never understood that. When computer role-playing games started up, I thought, this is the opportunity to hide all of that rubbish, like strength, constitution, to hide all that crap and just concentrate on what matters, which is the feeling of the story that you're in. And they didn't do that. And all the stuff that I hated about role-playing games was replicated in painful detail in the computer games.
I've seen game book apps where
1% on attack,
they actually simulate dice rolls, and then they say, why don't you shake the phone so you see the dice button? I just want to slap that person for even thinking it. Because if I'm playing a role-playing game, the dice are a necessary evil. They're not the reason we're playing the game. And if you could remove those things and make the adventure more immersive. Why would you keep saying, don't forget there are some dice here? I just don't get why you would do that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Most of all, if you're sitting like this in a train, pretending to read a book,
Yeah.
that's okay.
You don't want
If I
to.
sit in a train and I do it like this,
Yeah.
okay, I do it again
Yeah.
because it doesn't fit, and there's always a cheat mode, do it again.
And then by this time, the people sitting next to you seem to have moved.
Oh,
Out.
actually, that's another good point, because when people say you can always cheat in a game book, the very fact that the story is written in such a way that you can cheat shows it's badly designed. Because
Yeah.
choice shouldn't be immediately obviously good or bad.
Yeah.
It should be one of many interesting things that can happen.
I meant cheating in the combat.
No, I know, but what I mean to say is like every death paragraph is a failure of the writer
Well, yes,
to write a
that-
good story.
That's true,
Yes.
but the only reason that they're there is because you can't have an unlimited book. You have to shut off routes, and that means a death paragraph. So you have to. So if you have too many, it's because that's no good. It means you haven't got a proper storyline. So in the Fable Lands, for instance, things can happen. You get enslaved and you lose all your possessions, but you end up working as a galley slave and have a whole new set of adventures that take off. So in those, we try to avoid deaths, but you still die from combat.
But this is an
It's
area
quite
where Martin Nooch is really innovative because he's removed that. You take wounds, there are a point where wounds incapacitate you, but you never die from the wound. You can crawl away and you end up with scars, and if scars build up to a certain very high level, then that will end your adventure. But effectively you can get to 0 hit points, and all it means is you may find yourself in prison. Right, but he's always found a way for that to move you on to a new part of the story rather than close off your story.
And
it's closing off that's the
So it's a
bad.
retirement of some kind.
Yeah.
Yes, and in our Fable Lands books, you could go into certain temples and buy resurrection dealers. So if you had a resurrection dealer, you would write down paragraph 425 or whatever, and if you died, you go to that paragraph. You're reborn in the city of so-and-so. You lost all your stuff, but you can start again and you've still got your stats. So we tried to make death happen a lot, but not permanently. But talking of rolling dice and all that, it reminds me the other night, me and Dave and his wife Ros were sitting around the table, and it had been a role-playing evening, and we
Ros will often come down when
we'd all finished. But of course,
and
Dave and I
when she
had
knows
been
that we've stopped
drunk.
the game, she'll come down to
And
just
she
have
was-
a glass of wine.
She was trying to say something, and Dave and I were ranting at each other about Brexit. And she couldn't get a word in, so she just picked up 3 dice and rolled them.
Everyone around the table stopped.
No, it was just us. And
No,
you and
Oliver
I.
was there as well.
No, Oliver wasn't there. It was
No,
just
he
you
was.
and me.
Oliver
it?
was there.
We all
Yeah.
stopped. No, it wasn't. It was just you and me. We both just went, what's the dice say? And immediately stopped talking like that. Like you do. And then
Yeah,
Ros
it's like
would
a
say,
cat.
yeah. And then Ros went, well, I think. Oh, well, you actually, we're louder in the company. It's clever.
Yes.
Get some role
You can only
players
do
to
it
shut
once,
up,
though.
just roll some dice.
We'll
Yeah.
catch us again.
But it was funny how we both just went,
Yeah.
is it 3 ones?
I knew
Yeah,
you'd
if there
do
was,
that.
that would have been
I
impressive.
knew you'd do that.
Yeah. It's how dice become so important.
I just wanted to add to your question, expression, that probably the older generations which grew up with Lone Wolf, and now it's okay. I think it was a good idea and had pretty good ideas in follow up. But now, if I'm reading, I think I'm missing something. So I wanted to have more. So I wanted to have it a little more, more elegant in gameplay and new ideas, and that was I'm missing. So it was kind of not boring, but it wasn't surprising anymore.
They're very gamey, aren't they?
Yeah, and it was the same. It's always the same mechanics, and I think it was it wasn't not this
yeah.
It wasn't so difficult where you did your.
That's also why I'm kind of more interested, because you can have solve the plot, which is traditional game book. Here's a puzzle. Which door? Do you fight this thing? Do you win? And that's why with things like Frankenstein, I was interested in things like trust and alienation and demonization, because they're emotional registers rather than solving plot registers. So you're still making choices, but you can't even say at the end what was the right choice. You made decisions, like in life. You could look at life and you go, did I do the right thing back there? Because this thing might have happened, something else happened. They're rarely a clear cut. They're not puzzles that you solve all the way through. And so I think game books could maybe, because after all, the game books we wrote back then were mostly selling to 12-year-olds, you know, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. Now we're really writing for, you know, grown-ups, and I think those books could also grow up more.
Actually, that's the funny thing that my game books, when I got back onto the internet and saw what game book fans were saying about them, almost everybody said, yeah, I didn't like your game books when I read them. But actually now I'm older, I like it a little bit more. And I was remembering with Crimson Tide, for example, I've often said the correct, it's a revenge story basically. The correct ending of that is where you go into a monastery and you just completely give up revenge. You become a monk. And that, you know, I put that in there, and it's a death paragraph. But to me, actually, that's the correct ending. That you conquer your thirst for revenge.
Which brings up an interesting question. Nowadays, comic books used to be something aimed at young people. And nowadays we have graphic novels, and people talk about graphic novels like about proper literature.
Yeah.
So why shouldn't the game book genre move forward? And
Well,
become
a
something for
lot of
grown-ups?
people said that as soon as like a real author, Kim Newman, Life's Lottery, a lot of people credit that as the first literary game book. I'm not quite sure that it is, but I certainly think you're right.
Dave's Frankenstein.
Why shouldn't
I
there be
think
more?
Frankenstein is,
I didn't get that.
Well, so I'm going to do a print version, but the print version will lose 90% of what the app can do because of the conditional text. So I'm going to have to go through and think which of all the things I can bring to the print version, I'm going to have to abandon all these other things. I've got to decide what's the priority. But there are so many moments in Frankenstein that are emotional moments that depend on previous choices. A lot of those will have to be lost. So it can never be as interestingly different as maybe the app.
I mean, to me, a lot of the design of game books consists of having a system that conceals the flags. Like you were saying, that if you have a rating of trust and you know that, it upsets it all. But actually, the way that game books engage with your emotion is that they are reacting to your decisions, but you don't see that reaction.
That's a point. Yeah, you need clever design, and that was one of my favorite experience in the game book to understand how it works, and to see how clever. And in the first place, you don't exactly what is going on, and so if you put it in a clever way or conceal it or make it look different, and it's brilliant.
The trick is you're flagging things with little flags that appear to be something else. And the traditional way you do it is, do you have the jade scarab?
Yes.
Whatever. And on the one hand, it's an object in the story, but actually the jade scarab means you have met this guy and he hates you.
That's right.
Yeah. So.
As long as you don't make people drop off.
That was I talking with, for example, with Sven, because he's very brilliant with such kind of game mechanics to think how I can flag a thing, or perhaps make a layout. There's a lot of layout things which you can make. You can change colors, you can change shape of letters, of I don't know how it works, and it's a whole universe which you can use, and I think that's probably these unconventional ways which needed to be.
Something Paul was talking about yesterday, which I'm not conscious I ever did. Something like Frankenstein can make you lazy because the app is doing so much under the hood that I can just code in 50 alternate bits of text with slight changes. But you know, in print you're forced to be clever. And Paul was talking about how you might have a number of different choices that all feed into one paragraph, and that paragraph is sufficiently overdetermined in the way it's written that it makes sense whichever way you came to it. So it could be
That's
you
always a
made
headache trying to write
50 different types of mistake, and then you come to a paragraph that says you can't afford to keep making mistakes like that, but only the player knows. The player is storing part of the information of the story, so that unfolds in that way, so that could be really powerful.
That's a pure beauty, I tell you. That's a pure beauty.
Yes.
If you can consider it in an app, that's like to see a Porsche or anything, and you see the power, and you don't.
I know.
You're not allowed to watch on the road.
I'm aware.
You want to see the mission.
I'm very aware writing Frankenstein. It gives me huge opportunities, but also it makes me far less clever about how I have to be super smart. About I've only got the 400, 500 paragraphs, whereas in Frankenstein I was literally just. It's 160,000 words. It's like 1,000 something sections long, and that's not even the full story because every section has conditional text. So there's really more like 20,000 possible routes through, and but that's attacking it with a sledgehammer rather than a scalpel to cleverly do it.
I mean, Jamie was saying earlier about how, given that I didn't like game books originally, and I was persuaded by money, but actually by the end, thinking this kind of way of realizing that everyone talks about the splits, but the interesting thing is the convergence. That was the point where I started to think, I'm really excited and interested in this.
Yes, that is a very important point because everyone.
Just as I'd reached that point, fighting fantasy.
But yes, because ultimately you must converge everything.
Yeah.
And so if people only think in terms of splits, they end up with loads of death arrows.
Right.
And then they go, oh, their books are great because they've got all kinds of creative death arrows. But the truth is, you'd really rather avoid that because you really want it to be
how
a
do you
nicely
bring
shaped
things
adventure.
together
Yes.
is what makes game books interesting to me.
You had a question before.
I would like to come back to the two-player game books. I had the impression that that's an important point for you in the I think you made it clear for me. I think that you really like the idea, but I've got a problem with it because so I know game books, and I think most people out there seeing a Kickstarter about game books know what's going on, but I think very few people out there know how two-player game books function. And so as an advertising guy, I see a problem because you have to explain how it works.
Yeah.
You cannot just say it's a game book and kick back it. Is it possible to explain the main principle within the two?
They already know that we probably have to do it. That we do all of
I think you had a video.
I suppose we could do.
Because they are such fun to play.
We could do a video of two
people
playing
reality
it.
is, I have no clue how that could function.
No, well, I still. I mean, I've written game books, and I was looking at it, going, "Wow, what's Jamie done here?" It was really clever, but more importantly. As I say, I was playing it with a friend of mine who had a really nasty cold, and he completely forgot how miserable he felt. And we were like, and even he wrapped up, and we went out and it was winter to go and get the next book because we were having such fun with these books. And I think if we just even did a video of two people playing it, you get a sense of wow, that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Well, I think videos would be a nice tool to market like this. I remember I've seen a video a couple of months ago. There was a guy playing with his girlfriend a game book. So he was reading the book and she was deciding what to do. And it was a really clever thing because they were a nice couple, positive people. And you just thought, well, they have fun. And it seems to be a nice way to spend an evening.
I've got a friend who does that
sitting on the
as well.
couch watching Game of Thrones and eating potato chips. It's something much more intimate while you're doing something together.
And the image is so much an individual kind of isolated feeling. So as soon as you start saying no, this is social.
I got it. The two-player trip to IKEA game book.
One of them will kill the other.
Now, well, I think you can communicate something like that.
And
perhaps we need more of those videos, and that's not your job to do. Actually, it's our job because we have to publish stuff on the internet, and it just doesn't have to be high resolution professional camera equipment. Perhaps it's an iPhone, and just publishing stuff and having fun and reading to each other.
Yeah. Well, Leo does a lot of.
Basically, every game book is a two-player game book. If you look at
could be.
To be, yes.
There's a huge difference between sitting in a corner, mumbling like crazy to yourself, doing cryptic notes on a piece of paper.
And actually, a lot of parents tell me they're now doing that with their kids. They play the game book together. Bloodsword, for example. A lot of parents are playing it with their kids, saying, "What shall we do next?" So
gets the kids reading.
I'm dropping game book bombs everywhere where it's possible. I'm collecting game books. Every game book I have.
Also, I think a good example of this is Leo Harthouse does a lot of live action role playing, and he tells me about the things they've gone and done. And they're always fantastic. And if you heard them, I think they're great adverts for wanting to go live action, because like one was he took his son along and they were playing the extras, and his son was supposed to play an assassin, and he had to go into the hall where they're all feasting in the evening and put some poison. It was just a little sachet of herbs, but he had to say to the GM, "I put the poison into the pot of the stew." So he went in and he came back out, and Leo said, "Did you put the poison?" He said, "I was too afraid, Dad, they might have spotted me." And he goes, "Listen, son, you're an assassin now, and you're part of an assassin tradition. You've got to swallow up your fear, get back in there and poison those bastards." And he was going, I was giving my son a pep talk about how to murder a bunch of people. But when you hear that, you go, what a fun, that's such a fun, entertaining, I know that sounds a bit psychotic.
A little father-son talk.
Yes.
What I really like, about role-playing is the chance to fail in a most horrible and miserable way. Nowadays, computer games are just about being awesome, regardless of whatever you
Actually, I read an article recently that talked about the epidemic of depression, and it was talking about how the key to it is not treatment, but it's prevention. And one way of preventing depression is take up something, take up a hobby, singing or whatever, that you're not very good at. And then when you don't do very well, laugh. In other words, embrace failure. And I was thinking 5 years ago, I took up the guitar again. So I was way ahead of this Guardian article. I'm no good on the guitar, but I go up and stand and I play the guitar in front of people. And if I forget a chord, I laugh.
You learned that failure isn't something bad for itself.
No, that's exactly it. Yeah, it's our fear of failure, which is what winds us up.
Nowadays, people consume things that always try to give them the feeling that they are great.
Yeah.
They give it more and more and more. And if you stop playing something, you have this feeling, oh, suddenly nobody is telling me how great I am. I have to gain more and more and more.
Yeah.
And this is a really bad...
Well, they're trying to set up the psychological equivalent of a drug.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, the whole games are designed that way now.
I just tell
it's
myself.
It's about instant satisfaction.
I just tell
what you're doing, how good you are. You can get more of the satisfaction whenever you want.
Well, this is why I think like cheating.
You don't even have to be extremely successful. The game will always tell you you're great because you're earning points.
Yeah.
Even if you're a moderate player in the duel, you're still great.
Well, actually, I mean, when the first game book I did,
myself I'm great all the time.
yeah, you can take that. The first game book,
a mirror. I can see it each and every day.
Yes.
the first game book I did was Slaves to the Abyss, and the original ending of Slaves to the Abyss is that you actually sacrifice yourself in order to free the entire population of the city to return, and you exile yourself, and that was how it ended.
Yeah.
And Steve Jackson came back and said, "Oh, after all, doing all that difficult stuff, you should, Lord God Almighty should appear and say, jolly well done."
Here's a sack of gold.
Here's a sack of gold, yeah.
But to be fair, that's how those work.
And I hated that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought, the real victory was you've sacrificed yourself and saved a
But
whole
not
city.
for a 12-year-old kid.
So, which is why we accepted Yeah, well, you say that, but I don't know. I think maybe it is.
That's why they didn't like your books then, and they do
the
now.
point is, we game book writers,
Actually,
we are all 12-year-old
I'm
kids,
going to
really.
I'm going to dispute this particularly because
Right.
in the original Doctor Who Adventure with the Dalek, in the black and white Hartnell era, there's a bit where they're having to cross a chasm, and one of the Thals, who's coming with them, has been pretty cowardly, and he slips and falls, and he's going to pull some of the others into the chasm, and he cuts the rope and falls to his doom. So, you know, you think he was a coward up to now, but at the final moment he sacrificed himself. And I'm like 6 years old watching this, and I thought, that was great. Then they made a movie of it, and in the movie he cuts the rope, and they all go, oh God, he's died, and then he calls up, well, somebody get me out of here, and he's holding onto the ledge. And as now a 7-year-old kid, it was like, that's wrong! He fell into the chasm and you've completely screwed up that story. So I think, even at the age of 12, you can tell a good story from, here's a bag of gold, son.
Yeah, but that's not the same thing, and that's part of the story as you go along. It's when you complete it, whether you get the reward or not.
But the reward is saving the entire city.
Yeah.
Who cares
Well,
about
whatever.
saving people? I want the gold.
Well,
So I took the piss, and the eventual ending is that you can't go return to your world, but you become the new master of the abyss, and you're so effectively a god in the universe, and you have adventures spanning. So I was just mocking Steve Jackson. So that's the end of Slaves of the Abyss, is mockery of Steve
certainly in Hard
Jackson.
Vice, the endings where you get power are not the interesting
No. The lift doors closing is the best ending, I insist.
You relinquish that. Yeah. Well, like any good story, when you're a kid, you don't have to tell a 12-year-old that a story, you know, interesting stories aren't the ones that end with huge rewards. I mean, even as a 12-year-old reading good fiction,
I mean, your market
good
is
fiction is more nuanced than that. And you remember those books for the rest of your life. You don't remember the books where they just got a load of stuff at the end. So I think, you know, we could have been more adventurous, but the editors didn't really want us to be at the time. Now the opportunity is the readers are older and more sophisticated, and we have an opportunity to write better books as a result.
So Sven's lucky. He's got a better audience.
He's got a better audience,
You have too. This is, the world is getting smaller, so actually.
Well, these two guys do. I gave up long ago.
Yeah, but I think you all do a very fine job of your city, and you're unfinished. So you have a lot of pretty work up for you, and I think there will be a lot of good things coming up. So that's the thing. The community you can. Be on the other side of a planet and can exchange your thoughts to a project and work together. I think that's a way, and to get a feeling and your personal efforts done, and with the crowd cheering and saying, "Hey, that's what we are waiting." Don't shit on the publishers. You are your own man now.
Don't need them
your
anymore.
own hero. You can do what you want, and that's a good thing, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I guess, any other questions?
Thank you very much.